Thank you, Linda, for that lovely harp music for an introduction. I'd like to welcome all of you to our contemplative workshop on Edith Stein, led by Dr. Oliva Espin, who is Professor Emerita in the Department of Women's Studies at San Diego State University and the California School of Professional Psychology of Alliant International University. Dr. Espin was a pioneer in the practice and theory of feminist psychology and psychotherapy with women from different cultural backgrounds, for which she has received multiple awards from the American Psychological Association, the Association for Women in Psychology, and other psychology of immigrants and refugees, women saints, and other topics. She has presented at national and international conferences and published many articles and books on psychology and psychotherapy of Latinas, women immigrants and refugees, women's sexuality, language and therapy with fluent bilinguals, historical memory and memoir, feminist and psychological understandings of the lives and writings of women saints. And so without further ado, I present to you Dr. Oliva Espin to lead us through this workshop on Edith Stein.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad to see some familiar and unfamiliar faces. I think you can, you're seeing my screen, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
We're not seeing your slides, Oliva.
You're not. Okay. Well, I tried to get out and come back. I'm terribly sorry. Something is going on that it's not what I expected, and I don't seem to be able to. Okay, let me try to start from the beginning. Let me close this. Sorry about this. Let me close it and then share screen again. Ha. Okay, now it has disappeared completely. I thought I had it all under control. I'm terribly sorry. Okay. Okay, here we are. It should be coming in 1 second. Okay. Okay, here I am. I'm sorry. I thought I had it under control and then suddenly it stopped.
Take your time.
Okay.
It looks like we're getting there. So.
Okay, it's there now. Okay, so I'm going to start the slideshow. I hope nothing happens this time. Okay.
All right.
So let's start slideshow from beginning. Okay. Okay, are we seeing it?
Yes, we are.
Okay. 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 So when we are talking about Edith Stein, as opposed to other saints or figures we have discovered before in these little seminars, we sort of find a stumbling block, and it's that she never speaks about her own spiritual life. She always talks about ideas, mostly philosophical ideas, and about what other people have said. So, in fact, when she was asked some questions about her own spiritual development, her response was, "That's my secret," and refused to say anything else. So most of what we can do is surmise from what she wrote about what she was thinking and, developing what was going on inside her. So we are going to go over her biography, over some of her ideas, and then at the end, I want to focus on a little treatise she wrote a year before her death. Well, she's talking probably more about contemplation and about how to experience God than anything else that she ever wrote in her whole life. So let's start with her biography. And she was the 7th and youngest child of a Jewish family. She was born on Yom Kippur in 1891. Her family had a lumber business, and father died when Edith was 2 years old. And mother continued the business after the father died. And in fact, the business that had sort of trailed under the father's supervision prospered and became very successful under the mother. So in fact, the older children barely had an education, while Edith and her sister was 2 years older than her. So the two youngest children in the family had a very good education. Her sister was a physician and Edith was a philosopher. She was a very bright child who at 14 decided she had lost her faith and she was an atheist, whatever that meant for a 14-year-old. This is a picture of the family where Edith is right here, the youngest one. And this is a picture of the family after father died. So the picture of father, who's here, was sort of cut and attached to the picture of the rest of the family, which is a little peculiar, but okay. So in her youth, Edith was a member of the Prussian Society for the Women's Right to Vote. At that time, German society was experiencing changes about the role of women and about Jews. So she believed in the principles and the success of those movements and was sort of surprised and disappointed when she experienced discrimination either as a woman or as a Jew. She was a German patriot. So during World War I, she worked as a nurse. She was one of the first women to enter German university. And some people who have written about this say that professors didn't know what to do with these women who were joining university. She started studying psychology at the University of Breslau, but was disappointed by psychology's limitations, which I find very funny considering that it's what I studied. But in any case, she felt that, and in fact, the psychology she was studying was all very experimental. So it didn't touch the human being as she wanted to. So she went to Göttingen to study philosophy with Edmund Husserl. And there she is when she was a student. And this is Husserl, who was a famous and influential philosopher, the creator of something, of a philosophy he called phenomenology. He, however, was not a very likable person, and we'll see some of that later. Okay, so Edith, in the center of this photograph here, was the second woman to receive a philosophy degree in a German university. The first one was Hedwig Conrad Matthews, who became her lifelong friend. She graduated in 1916, so in the middle of First World War, with a thesis on the nature of empathy. And this is one of her greatest contributions to the field of philosophy. Her work, this is her when she ended her thesis, and this is the book. The Institute of Carmelite Studies in Washington, D.C. has published practically all her works in English. So the Institute of Carmelite Studies, Washington, D.C., if you look for that, you will find all of Stein's work. But I want to warn you that they're very thickly philosophical. They're not like soft, easy reading. So for her, in her thesis, empathy involves bodies and mind, both mine and others. And we see others first as bodies, but we then try to understand what is the substance of this person. And the other person who encounters me does the same, assuming we are having an empathic understanding, assuming we are really meeting as human people. So the first person experience, my experience, gets revealed to me as a third person perspective. So this person who empathizes with me sort of shows what they see about me, and that tells me better who I am. And empathy does that and comes and goes, not only between two individuals who may be talking to each other, and the person who's revealing back to me how they perceive who I am in their empathic encounter with me may be saying things, but it may not be saying anything. It may be just the way in which they're responding to me, that it's giving me a message about who I am. And this happens, as I said, between individuals, but it also happens in the context of community, where everyone does this for everyone. So self-knowledge, yes, may have to do with the way in which I think about myself, but it also comes from what others know about me and reveal to me about myself from their own standpoint. And there are some people who have written recently about this and talk about if we all thought of empathy as Edith Stein thought about it, there would be fewer conflict because people would try to see each other as they're being seen and would communicate in a more human way. So our environment, our relationships, in other words, determine who we become, determine who we are. And this is actually, empathy is a very important concept in psychology and in psychotherapy. Some people, they say, can be resumed by walking in somebody else's shoes. But it's basically, there's not possibility of good therapy. There's no possibility of good relationship, of human development, if we are not there in some way for each other, trying to understand. And it's not that this never fails. In fact, in psychology, we talk about, in psychotherapy, we talk about empathy is a necessary condition. You start not only in therapy, but the little child, the baby, has an empathic feeling, a caring feeling from whoever the caretakers are. And that feeling becomes internalized. But the people on the outside are bound to fail. And thankfully, since you have internalized the conception of yourself that those initial loving reactions have given you, you're able to stand by yourself, even when those people abandon you. So it's a very important and essential concept for human development. And as I said, she wrote this in 1916 when she was in her 20s and when she was not in any way a religious person, on the contrary. So it's a very interesting and powerful document that way. Okay, so after she graduated, she worked as Husserl assistant and collaborator. She taught what she called the philosophical kindergarten, so new people who were coming to be with Husserl. And she worked in his manuscripts and etc. But slowly, she started getting disappointed about his reaction, bored with his work, and decided to apply for her own academic position that in Germany is called habilitation. And she was denied a position simply because she was a woman. Husserl did not support her application for a position until it was too late. Many men in many universities were not going to admit a woman, much less a Jewish woman. So she protested to the Ministry of Education, and as a consequence, the ministry declared, quote, belonging to the female sex may not be seen as a hindrance for obtaining habilitation. And German female professors to this day give Edith Stein credit for challenging the exclusionary rules. They credit her for the presence of women faculty in German universities a number of years ago. I remember how long. There was the 50th anniversary of women in German universities, and there was a big celebration in honor of Edith Stein for having made this possible. And I have a dear friend who was a professor for many years in a German university, and she personally said that it was thanks to Edith Stein that they were all there. But what happened was that the new rule from the ministry came too late. She had already applied and been rejected, and she was not about to start applying again because a number of other things were happening in her life at that time. After the First World War, a conversionary impulse, somebody has called it that, was sweeping over Europe. You know this thing about there are no atheists in foxholes. I don't know if you have heard that saying. That was what it was. I mean, the confrontation with a horrible amount of death and suffering of World War I made a lot of people start rethinking about spiritual matters. And it affected German Jews, it affected French Catholics, it affected all Europeans. Some people converted to Christianity. There were lots of Jews converting to Christianity at this time. And some were, it always happens because of convenience, but there were a lot of real authentic conversions, like it happened to Edith Stein eventually. And some went back to their original faith that they had abandoned because they were too sophisticated to be Catholic, for example, or whatever. Probably the best known case was Franz Rosenzweig, who was a German Jew who considered converting to Christianity and decided that before he did that, he was going to study Judaism to know what it was there. And he discovered, that the faith of his ancestors was still important and vital and had something to say to him. So he did a lot of very good writing around that. And then Jacques Maritain and his wife Raisa, Max Scheler, and Charles Péguy, the writer, Josh Rouault, the painter. I don't know if you have seen paintings of Rouault, but they're absolutely magnificent. He's one of my favorite painters in the world. And they all converted back. I don't know if you can say converted back, but they sort of considered the faith in a new light and became real Catholics or real Jews, as in the case of Franz Rosenzweig, after this experience of a spiritual reflection. So the phenomenologists, the other people who were working in Stein's circle, many of them were agnostic Jews. They were seeking in their work as phenomenologists an understanding of the phenomenon of religion, because phenomenology did not want to exclude the analysis of anything. And they were interested in the metaphysical phenomenon, in the religious phenomenon, etc. And eventually, in that process, many of these agnostic Jews phenomenologists converted to Christianity. They mostly converted to Lutheranism, which was the official religion in Germany. Husserl himself converted to Lutheranism. And Edith's closest friends converted to Lutheranism. So despite her friends and colleagues' conversions, she remained intellectual and was not interested in anything religious. Her professor and dear friend, Adolf Reinach, was killed in World War I. And she, Edith, went to see the widow to help her arrange his papers. And there was a conversation in which Anna is talking about, I know I will see him again. And she was very impressed. And in fact, she narrates this conversation later in her life as something that impressed her very deeply, but still, it did not move her to conversion. However, after a long night reading the biography of Teresa of Avila, of Saint Teresa of Jesus, she finished this book, closed it, and said, this is the truth, and decided to convert to Catholicism. It's sort of strange that this very rigid, philosophical, intellectual woman was moved to conversion, but Teresa, who, as we all know, was made of fire. It's all emotion, all expression, etc. In any case, She converted to Catholicism, Edith Stein, and was baptized on January 1922, at the age of 30. Something interesting is that neither Stein nor most people, I mean, practically no one at that time, knew that Teresa descended from a family of Spanish conversos. So it's a very intriguing question of how this woman who had Jewish ancestry influenced this other woman who was Jewish but was not really a practicing Jew, even though their personalities are so very different. It's a very intriguing question. So why did she convert to Catholicism rather than Lutheranism, which, as I said, is what everybody was converting? Christianity was converting to Lutheranism. And here I take some quotes from the writer Patricia Hampel, who writes about Stein. And these two quotes are help me understand her decision. In spite of its glaring refusals and inequities, Catholicism remains the only Western tradition that has an unbroken history of providing a respected way of life for women outside the domestic role of wife and mothers. Although Catholicism is rife with sexism, its history of distinguished female intellectuals, artists, abbesses, and saints, as well as the validation of celibacy, sharply differentiated from Lutheranism and Judaism. Women in convents, and there's an interesting book from a very well historian in which she says that feminist consciousness survived through the centuries in convents where women were by themselves reading and writing and praying and being together. So in fact, as an unmarried Catholic professional woman and later as a nun, Stein continues to write and teach all her life. And there are some articles by women Jewish rabbis who have discussed that as a Catholic, Stein found a way of life in the company of other women that would not have been available to her as a Jewish woman. So it's an interesting thing to think. Despite all the sexism in Catholicism, there's still an avenue for something that has persisted through the centuries that supports women not being married and being by herself, doing their own work. So this is Edith around the time she converted, around the time she was trying to get habilitation and couldn't, and etc. So unable to find a position at the university, she started teaching at St. Magdalena, which is a Dominican institution for women in the city of Speyer. It's an institution, or it was an institution that combined what we would consider the last 2 years of high school and the first 2 years of college. So it was that part of life that they did for women at that time. This is my photograph of St. Magdalena as it looks today, which is pretty much what it looked like in her time. And this is the room she had there. There's a photograph of her in there. And as you can see, there's a crucifix and a menorah. And this was her bedroom and also the office where she worked in that building I just showed you before. And again, this is my own photograph. So it's now a little chapel in her honor right there in that room. So while in Speyer, while in these institutions, Stein translated Thomas Aquinas and John Newman into German. She also wrote about the intersection in the philosophies of Aquinas and Husserl. And all this work, I mean, she continued doing philosophical work, and that made her very well known in philosophical circles. She met Jacques Maritain personally and some of these other luminaries of Europe during that time. And in fact, she was very well known as a philosopher, and somehow she sort of has been forgotten as a philosopher, and mostly being lately, because of the canonization and etc., seeing more as a religious figure, when during her lifetime, she was not so much seen as a spiritual teacher, she was seen as a philosopher, and her work taken very seriously as a philosopher. So another thing that happened during this time in Spire is that she became very interested in the education of women. And according to an author, she became the voice of Catholic feminism in German-speaking countries. So from around the time when she started working at Spire, right after she converted, to the time when she entered the convent in 1933, so roughly a period of about 10 years, she gave lectures constantly about the role of women and about feminism and about what the Catholic Church had to say about these things. This is also from Spire. This is also my photograph. And what you see here are her classrooms list with the grades for her students and etc. And this is one of her students who became a Dominican nun, the schedule of her classes, etc. And they have there also the handwritten manuscript of her translation of Aquinas, because she did it by hand, as I said, while she was there. I don't have a photograph of that one, but they have like a little museum there in her honor. Okay, so this book is again from the Institute of Carmelite Studies. It's a collection of her writing on women, of her presentations, of these presentations, these speeches she gave, these papers she wrote about women during these about 10 years. And you can see here, this is her real signature, how she signed things. And the second edition, which is the one that is here, it's much more complete and much more revised. The first edition had a few errors in attribution of different things, etc. So the second edition from 1996 is the one that is more accurate about her work. Okay, so what did she say about men and women? And it's interesting that some of the things she said sounds like very essentialist. Women are this, men are that. The mission of women is this, the mission of women is that. So it looks a little like the complementarity of John Paul. And a lot of people are trying to say, oh, she just said what John Paul said. Even some people have said, oh, John Paul was a feminist as Edith Stein. Well, okay, that's stretching it a little bit. Because, yes, she saw essential differences between the mission of men and women, but she was very adamant that those differences were never to be construed as proof of women's inferiority, but rather as a sign of women's unique value. She saw the morally superior position of women as a positive trait, as a statement of women's responsibility to use these capabilities to combat evil. And, let's remember that she's doing this as National Socialism, the Nazi party ideology, it's beginning to grow and take hold. And that ideology says pretty much that women are biological entities that should produce children and shut up. And she has a very strong position against that idea. So it may sound like, oh, she's not saying it strong enough, but in the context in which she was saying, as a woman and as a Jew, in the middle of the Nazis beginning to hold more and more power, it is clear that she is taking a very strong position against the dominant ideology. So although she believes that women have a mission because they are the educators, and she thinks that women should educate women, it's one of the points she makes, Nonetheless, she rejects all idealizations of women, particularly idealizations that could be used to exclude women from active participation in their profession or from involvement in the national political life or the life of the church. He even has some writing which very ironically says, "Oh, these people were talking about the, the weaker sex and the noble sex and all those things. What they are doing is using those things to keep women in their place. This is not understanding of the value of women. This is describing women in a certain way to use them for their purposes." So she's very, very strong about that. So she says, these are literal quotes, "Every so-called masculine occupation may be exercised by many women, as well as many feminine occupations by certain men." And then also another quote, "No legal barriers of any kind should exist, which should prevent a natural choice of vocation for either women or men." So to say women can only do this and men can only do that, or this thing can only be done by women, this thing can only be done by men, she finds that ridiculous. And again, remember that we are talking about the 1920s and early 30s. We are not talking about a century later when we have different ideas about what should or should not be. At that time, saying these things was a challenge to the status quo. And it had been since the end of the 19th century. And she grew up without first wave of feminism and sort of was very much a carrier of that thinking. She was equally adamant about issues of the role of women when these issues involved the Catholic Church. She believed that the church needed woman power and strongly asserted that the call to work for the transformation of the world was issued to both man and woman. So she insisted that there was no theological reason that women should not become priests. And this is a direct quote from one of her lectures that it's about, see the title, "The Separate Vocation of Man and Woman According to Nature and Race," sort of then betrays some of, or contradicts some of what she's saying. Okay, "Women are demanding," this is a little quote from her, "that their activities be recognized as an ordained church ministry. And it may well be that one day attention will be given to their demands. Whether this will be the first step on the path leading women in the priesthood is the question. It seems to me that such implementation by the church cannot be forbidden by dogma." So she's very clear about what she thinks, that women should be ordained priests. And there are other quotes where she says similar things. I just chose this one because it's short and simple. It's interesting that a number of people who wrote about Stein in the 1950s and 1960s keep dismissing what she said. "Oh yeah, well that, she came from that movement, and yeah, those things, she went a little bit too far, but she really did not mean that." And it's very interesting, that John Paul, who was so adamant against the ordination of women, decided to completely ignore what she had said about these things when it came to canonizing her. So if you think about it, he's saying women shall not be ordained and no one can talk about this, and this is it. And then he's canonizing Stein, who wrote, among other things, these things that you have in front of you right now. So, okay, and that's an interesting detail. Okay. So after years in Spire, she took a position at a teacher's college in the city of Münster called the Institute for Scientific Pedagogy. And while she was working at this institution, on an evening in 1933, a casual acquaintance, unaware of her Jewish ancestry, talked about the anti-Jewish measures instituted by the Third Reich. Hitler had been elected Reich Chancellor in January of that year of 1933. So this was a couple of months after Hitler had been elected. And in her words, I had indeed already heard of severe measures being taken against the Jews. But now, all of a sudden, it was luminously clear to me that once again, God's hand lay heavy on his people, and I knew that the destiny of these people was my own. So she almost has a prophetic awareness of what is happening or what will happen to her at a time when people did not know that this was going to happen because the concentration camps had not started yet. So it's an interesting, that the destiny of these people is my own. This is her at this time, sort of when she's at the end of her career as a professor, and she decides to enter the Carmelites. The first thing she did was to try to get an audience with Pope Pius XI to ask to write an encyclical about anti-Semitism, but she could not obtain the individual audience that she wanted, so she sent a letter through the superior of the Benedictine order, who had been her spiritual director for a number of years. And okay, so I'll get to that later. So Pius XI did commission an American Jesuit to write an encyclical against anti-Semitism, but he died shortly after, and his successor, Pius XII, who was the Pope during the Second World War, used part of this text for an encyclical on peace, but never wrote an encyclical against anti-Semitism. Pius XI had written an encyclical for the Germans, not for the whole church, for the Germans, about the dangers of the Nazis. But, and this Jesuit he commissioned to do this, to write this encyclical, had written and worked about racial issues in the US, and there's a lot of discussion to have about him, because even the text of the encyclical, even though he's saying we should not go around killing Jews, it's also saying, well, you know, Jews are not so good. So it's very ambiguous writing about Jews, like he's writing about African Americans, but also ambiguous, the American Jesuit I'm talking about. But no, it was better than what was happening at the time. So let's give them a little credit, even though they don't understand things like we do. So shortly after her attempt to influence the Vatican against anti-Semitism, she was asked by the Teachers College, where she was working, to stop lecturing because she was. So she had been a Catholic for 11 years. She was known as a Catholic philosopher, and yet she was Jewish. So the Nazis were not having it. And the director of the institute, who was supposedly a Catholic, probably a priest, asked her to leave. Supposedly she was to stay doing research, but she could not teach. And then by the end of the academic year, she was told that not even that she just had. So again, in her words, I was almost relieved to find myself now involved in the common fate of my people. But I have, of course, to consider what I was to do. And, you know, since she converted, she wanted to become a Carmelite, but the superior of the Benedictines, who was her spiritual director, said, no, you have a lot to do in the world. You have a lot of things to teach to the world. You are not going in the convent right now. And there's a letter from this guy, from this abbot, saying, you know, at that moment, I could not tell her that she had to stay. I could not tell her that she had to continue fighting, because she had no more the possibility. She had no platform anymore. So he said, okay, permission to go into the convent. So what she decided to do, and her spiritual director approved, was that after this dismissal, that the time had come to honor her greater desire that she had started after reading the autobiography of Teresa of Avila and her conversion to Catholicism 12 years earlier, to enter a Carmelite monastery. So she entered the Carmel in Cologne in 1933. And as was to be expected, her family's reaction expressed confusion, considering the historical moment. What are you doing? Not only converting, but also going into a convent when everybody's trying to leave Germany and, save themselves. This is a photograph of her clothing. In many convents, women would dress as brides when they were going to get into the convent. So this is her photograph of that moment. And this is a chasuble that was made with her material of her dress by the nuns. This is my photograph, and my camera was about to die, so the photo is rather blurry, but it's the nuns put it out for me to take a photograph and see it, and etc. that time. So this is something interesting. Early in her convent life, she finished writing an autobiography she had started in Breslau. She placed her autobiographical undertaking in the context of memoirs of other Jewish women than referred to Christian women autobiographies, including, not only Carmelites, Teresa of Lisieux and Teresa of Avila, but Teresa of Avila's biography had made her decide to convert. And yet, she doesn't mention that, because in this document, she really wants to talk about who Jews are and sort of debunk all the myths that the Nazis are propagating about Jews. So she's describing her family. And although it's an autobiography, supposedly, it's mostly a description of her family rather than of herself and what she felt and her spiritual development and etc. And she stops the document at the time of getting her doctorate in 1916, where she got this thesis on empathy, and at no point mentions her conversion. And there's some authors who say, oh, she would have done it if she had time to continue writing. But having written a memoir myself, I'm writing about my childhood. I'm not writing about adulthood, but when I'm writing about my childhood, I can sort of show something that will happen later that maybe I will not write about, but sort of give an inkling of what came later after this thing. She never does that. She never gives an inkling that she converted to Catholicism. So even though it's described as an autobiography, life in a Jewish family is, as I said, and she says it in the introduction to the book, this is to debunk myths about Jews. This is not so much about what happened to me. It's something that the German people need to know about what Jewish families really are. So she omits reference to her conversion and vocation as a nun, but ends with her doctoral dissertation without touching on the circumstances of her life. There are some authors who say that she wanted to make sure that people did not sort of dismiss what she was saying about Jewish people by saying, oh, well, you're different because you converted. So, yes, you were Jewish, but yeah, you converted. So you understood that Judaism was not what you should be at. So she did not want to diminish the value of what she was trying to say about Jews. This is a long quote for Rachel Felher-Benner, who has written a lot about Stein. And something she says is it appears that Stein's Jewishness played a crucial role in her Christian life. Her determination to assert her Jewish identity at the time of the Nazi terror emerges paradoxically as the validation of the vision of redemption that she strove to find in the church. Stein's Weltanschauung thus denotes a convergence of religious identity rather than the conversion from one identity into another. She seems to find no contradiction, claiming her part in Jesus and at the same time asserting her ties to the Jewish people. And as we will see when we talk about canonization, many Jewish people do not, Brenner is Jewish, but many of them do not agree with that. They think she converted, she was not a Jew. But Brenner, who has read very carefully her Stein's actions and Stein's letters and that kind of thing, sees very clearly that Stein saw no contradiction in the two. She felt very Jewish and she felt very Catholic. And in fact, of course, she has the prejudices of the pre-Vatican Catholicism before pre-Vatican II Catholicism in her writing, but she's at the end even sees herself as playing the role of Queen Esther in relation to her people, sacrificing her own life for the sake of her people, and understands it that way. So she made her final profession as a Carmelite in 1938, and shortly after was sent from Cologne to the F. Carmel in the Netherlands to protect her and the nuns in her Cologne convent from Nazi persecution. They could not be sheltering a Jew, so she was endangering the other nuns in the convent by staying in Germany. And she was not the only one. Probably the most known is Anna Frank and her family, but there were innumerable German Jews who went to the Netherlands thinking that they would be protected there. This was, as you can see from the date, 1938, before the beginning of the war. In fact, it was right after Kristallnacht, after the destruction of synagogues and Jewish business and etc. in November 1938. And they thought that they were going to be, all these Jews who moved to the Netherlands, that they were going to be protected. But a year after, or several months after the beginning of the war, the Netherlands, there was an invasion and other things happened there. So in Echt, she was joined in the Netherlands by her sister Rosa, her older sister, who had also converted to Catholicism after the death of their mother. So this is Edith in the convent, and this is actually her passport picture. In order to have this picture taken, she opened a little bit the door of the convent, of the cloister, and a photographer took her picture and it was put in her passport so she could cross the border into the Netherlands. This is the convent in Echt, where she arrived at the end of December 1938, and from which she was taken by the Gestapo. So, okay. So, after the Nazis invaded the Netherlands in 1940, some Christian churches started protesting the deportation. The Nazis pretty much said, shut up, or the converts in your religion are going to be in trouble. And apparently, the National Dutch Church, the Lutheran Church, decided to, okay, we protested enough, let's not say more. But the Catholic bishops of the Netherlands wrote a pastoral letter that was read on all churches on July 26, 1942. And this pastor letter condemned the deportation of Jews. This is just a paragraph, deeply shaken by the measures against the Jews, etc. At the very end, the denial in these regulations of God's precepts of justice and mercy forces the undersigned, the Catholic bishops, to request most urgently that these regulations shall not be carried out. So of course, it was ignored. And the Nazi authorities of the Netherlands had counted on the silent submission or anti-Semitism of Christian religious leaders that they had encountered in Germany and in other countries. And they were outraged at the audacity of the Catholic bishops. And in retaliation, euphemistically, they refused to guarantee the safety of Catholic Jews. So the following week, on August 2nd, so a week after reading this pastoral in the churches, all non-Aryan members of religious communities and a bunch of other Jews who had converted to Catholicism, so about 300 people in all, were taken. Edith Stein and her sister Rosa were among them. They were transported to several camps, and they finally arrived in Auschwitz, Birkenau, on August 9th. So her day of death is taken as August 9th, because that's the day the transport arrived, and there's no more notice about any of the people who were in that transport. So, I mean, she was already a middle-aged woman, and her sister Rosa was even older. So they probably were gassed immediately because they were no use to be workers. This is a picture of her from 1942 that it's very unclear who, where, how was it taken, but it is in a couple of places that have to do with her. And this is the entrance to Auschwitz that we have seen in innumerable photographs. Work would make you free, and of course, we know that that's not the case. And this is a certificate from the Netherlands Red Cross saying what I just said. She, Edith Teresa Edith Stein, born in Breslau, Carmelite nun, etc., etc. This transport arrived at Auschwitz, so that's declared the date of her death. So let's finish with this for a moment, and then we'll go into a little break and a second part. John Paul canonized Edith Stein in October of 1998. She wanted to present her as a bridge and did his best, but he did not succeed. In fact, her canonization created a lot of complications and controversies and confusions and etc. And even some confusion among Catholics. This is a book written by her niece about Stein and the family and etc., where she talks about the confusions and the disagreements even inside the family about this canonization. And the confusion is, of course, if she died because she was a Jew, how is she a martyr of the Catholic Church? And the justification is that she might not have been killed. We don't know that, but she might not have been killed were it not for the bishop's letter. For sure, she was killed because of the bishop's letter. So her death was a direct consequence of her being a Catholic and the actions of the Catholic Church. Other people say, well, there were 6 billion who died, even members of her own family. What do you mean she was the martyr? In fact, not even the 21 people who died with her in that particular transport, including her sister Rosa, are included. And there's a number of other canonized saints that are so-and-so and his companion so-and-so and her companions. It could have been Edith Stein and her companions, but it's only Edith Stein. So people say, well, what about people who died with her under the same circumstances? How come it's only her? So there are lots of reactions about this canonization. And this is actually the moment of the canonization. You can see up here the official picture that for the passport, etc. And here is the Pope reading the document and the people who are bringing this. And I was with a group of students in 7th row. So this is my photograph, very blurry, very bad. And at that time, because it was right before the year 2000, the facade, all the walls of St. Peter were being renovated. So the St. Peter was covered with all these scaffolding. So it's not particularly pretty, but okay. And this is the other side. This is from where I was going in the direction of the Tiber, in the direction of the river back here. And you can see it's a sea of heads all the way back, going to the end of this. And again, very photographed because I'm not a particularly good photographer. Okay, something that John Paul did, or the liturgists did very carefully, was that the readings and the homily in the canonization mass emphasized the message John Paul was trying to convey about the Jews. And, John Paul, for all his effects in other territories, was the first Pope who really opened up in the relationship with the Jews. So the readings for the mass were Queen Esther, and Queen Esther took refuge in God, etc. St. Paul in the Galatians, it is out of the question that I should boast except the Christ of Jesus. Peace and mercy to all who follow this as the rule unto the Israel of God. And the gospel is the Samaritan woman at the well, but rather than going into the whole thing that have to do with this chapter of John's chapter 4, it's only these verses where the Samaritan woman said to Jesus, I see you're a prophet. Our fathers worship on this mountain, though you Jews say that Jerusalem is the place that we ought to worship. Jesus said, believe me, woman, the hour is coming when you will worship neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you don't know, for salvation comes from the Jews. So he was very clear on the message he wanted to transmit, despite of the fact that it wasn't terribly successful, but okay. And again, although of a different order altogether, her feminist positions actively contradicted John Paul's, including her opinions about the ordination of women, as I said earlier. Some have tried to use some of her more essentialist comments about the value of women and their work to argue that she was in agreement with the Pope's position, so she was not truly a feminist. But John Paul was so intent on canonizing her that he obviously decided to ignore her feminism. So before we go into some of this small treatise that is very interesting about contemplation and prayer, let's take 7-10 minutes break until around 11:10, and we will have Linda play for us some of her beautiful harp music while we're on break, so we can try to keep the silence and remain mute and try to remain inside the experience rather than get scattered, which is easy. Okay, so see you in 7 minutes at 11:10. Linda, take away. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Linda. Beautiful music, as
You're
always.
welcome.
Okay, so let's get some into whatever we can glean about contemplation and prayer from some of Stein's writing. To begin with, as I said before, she did not write about this specifically. Her writing is basically philosophical. And that's what she's well known for. While she was in the convent, she wrote several short biographies of Carmelite saints, including one on Teresa of Avila, but basically continued writing philosophy. And in fact, at some point, she could not publish it under her name because it was a Jewish name. So she just said, well, I'm not publishing, and sort of stopped publishing for a while. And some of her larger works even were published after her death. Her last book, unfinished book, was a book about John of the Cross that she entitled The Science of the Cross. And her religious name was Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. And this is actually the first book of Stein that was translated into Spanish. As you can see, I have it in Spanish, because it was a book about John of the Cross. So in Spain, obviously, there was an interest to see what she was saying, but also because she had chosen the cross as her name, and John had chosen the cross. So he wanted to she wanted to sort of look at John of the Cross. And in fact, the book is incomplete. It ends in the moment where John of the Cross died, but there's no discussion of it, really. And that's because she was detained when she was in the process of writing this book. And one of the things I did when I was in the Carmel of Cologne, in addition to taking photographs of some things, was I had in my hand this last page he wrote, that it's in plastic to preserve it. And it was very moving to sort of realize, my God, she was writing this when she was detained. So it was very touching to do that. And again, in her autobiography, as I said before, she does not write about conversion. She does not write about her prayer life. Unlike Teresa of Avila and Teresa of Lisieux, who write about this is who I am and this is what God did in my life, she never did. Her response was always, this is my secret. I'm not going to talk about this. But we know, and this is actually a description from her spiritual director from the monastery of Boiron, that she spent hours kneeling without moving at all, in an almost rigid posture in blissful contemplation. These two quotes are from her spiritual director, the abbey superior of that monastery, in the chapel, whenever she came there for retreat, which was once or twice a year. So we know that she had a very deep prayer life, but did not want to say a word about it to anyone. Now this thing doesn't want to move. I'm sorry. Okay. So in order to try to get a window into some of her ideas on this topic, I chose, it's not necessarily, I'm not sure if it's a good choice, but it's one of the things that sort of inspired me. It's a little book, a little booklet, it's a treatise, very small, entitled Ways to Know God, written in 1941. And it's a description of pseudo Dionysius writing about ways to know God. So we can say that her writing on empathy and the impact of empathy on the development of community has a profound contemplative perspective. But as I said, at that time, she wasn't even a Christian. So it's sort of hard to use it in terms of contemplation and prayer, even though it's deeply in that. So let's see what she says about ways to know God. And she starts Ways to Know God. The longest part of this booklet is a long disquisition about who Dionysius was, who he was not, what he wrote, his most important points, what we can learn about this kind of theology and that kind of theology. So she writes very dryly. And so it's a very dry writing about that. But then we get to some points that I'm quoting some points from that treatise that sort of, as I said, give us a window about some of what she's thinking. And although supposedly she's describing what Dionysius said, she's also in a way saying, this is what I think. And because she's putting it out as something that it's important to recognize. So the ascent to God is an ascent in darkness and silence. Practitioners of centering prayer know what, this, I don't know if they know what this means. I don't, it's a familiar way of putting things. The ascent to God is an ascent in darkness and in silence. We are going to encounter in the immersion into the darkness, which is above all comprehension, not only poverty of words, but a total lack of words and of understanding. So there's a place where you encounter God, where there are no words and no clear understanding of what is going on. And again, these concepts are very familiar, even perhaps we haven't experienced them, yes, no, but it's sort of something that is a familiar concept. Words don't do what needs to be done when we are talking about getting to God and encountering the divine. Okay, so there are different ways of knowing God, says Dionysius, and then says Edith. One is through nature. The world presents still another inside, beyond the inside of the world studied by science. Our world points beyond itself, and thus leads the mind to transcend the boundaries of this world. So looking at nature, really, truly absorbing nature, and that goes from trees and flowers through clouds to stars, through fog, like I'm looking at out of my window right now. Nature says something about God that points beyond what we're seeing in nature. Then we can know God through faith, which is the acceptance and retention of revelation, not synonymous with belief, accepting and retaining and making part of yourself the words of revelation, the self-manifestation of the word in scripture. It's much more than I believe in this and I believe in that. It's something that is deeper, and it's always a gift, it's always a grace. And then through encountering God directly. And we never know when that is going to happen, because God speaks through messengers, through scriptures, through others, or through some feeling, through some experience of God's presence. So God does not cease to be the hidden God, but there is, or can be, a personal experience of the feeling of God's presence, which in the strictest sense, it's a personal encounter with God. This transition into the personal encounter can be compared to making the personal acquaintance of a person whose existence we knew only by means of certain effects. I read so-and-so's book. I've seen such and such actor in a play or in a film, or a painter. I've seen her paintings, and suddenly I see the person. So suddenly meeting that person sort of reveals, makes me acquainted with what that person is in a way that I knew about this person from the writing, from the painting, from the playing a certain role, etc. But now I am meeting this person. And faith furnishes the bridge from this transition. It is with the help of faith that we learn to see God in so many messages that we receive every day. But it can be a gift of grace bestowed on a person previously void of faith. In a way, it's almost like what happened to her, where she was saying, I don't believe, I don't believe, I don't believe. And suddenly she reads Teresa of Avila and says, oh my God, I believe. So, it can be, faith can be the bridge, but something can happen to a person who does not have faith or who does not have understanding. If this experience of the presence of God by something we are reading, by a person who's talking to us, by just looking out into the world, if the experience is accepted, the whole event will present the character of an inner revolution and transformation. In other words, you sort of see the face of God. And because you see the face of God, there's something that transforms you and sort of creates a revolution inside yourself. And I think we all have had inklings of this. It's not something that stays there. It's not something that is a permanent state. Maybe for some people who are mystical, that's the case. But for most of us, I think there are glimpses of this awareness of the presence of God, if we have had it at some point. And that is very transformative. We sort of know that God is there. An unbeliever, says Stein, does not become acquainted with God by reading scripture. Just a reading of scripture, like let's look at what this or that gospel, epistle, prophet, whatever says. It's not gonna find God in that, unless it be that such reading awakens faith in this person. A believer accepts the reading of scripture in faith, but it does not mean that the person apprehends everything in a living manner. In other words, I am a believer, I'm reading scripture, yes, yes, I believe this, yes, yes, I'm taking this in faith, but it may not be touching, it may be almost a routine that it's not touching me deeply. And then a word in the scripture may strike the innermost being of a person who may feel directly addressed by God in that particular moment, in that particular word, and become aware of God's presence. It's a feeling that God is speaking directly to me. And that can happen sometimes, even when I read this passage 60,000 times, and I know what it says and what the next word is. And yet there's a moment when I read something and it's suddenly God is talking to me and I'm encountering God at that moment. So the experiential knowledge of God is the fulfillment of faith. In other words, having faith is a way, it's a bridge, as we said before. It's something that in itself, the faith that this is God does not just happen except when there's the experiential knowledge of God. And again, some kind of encountering God takes place at the level of nature and natural knowledge. In all true knowledge of God, it is God who comes to us. It is not us who are going to God. Although there's a place where Stein says, anyone who's looking for truth, be it in science, being in whatever, in wherever you're looking for truth, you're looking for God, even though you may not know that. So she's very intent on that. And in a way, that's a way in which she's describing herself, because she was looking for truth. She didn't know she was looking for God, but of course she was looking for God. And in all true knowledge of God, it is God that is coming to us. When we have started seeking, God has already started seeking us. We have heard this a number of times. All speaking about God presupposes God speaking. In other words, when I'm talking about God, it's God speaking. I don't want to be pretentious. I'm talking about God right now. In a way, whatever occurs to me to say to you has to do with what God wants me to say at this particular moment. Because I have some brilliant ideas sometimes that I completely forget. And other things come to me in the moment when I'm talking. So anytime when I'm going to start teaching anything or talking about anything, I always pray that I say what people need to hear, not what I think they should be hearing. And of course, yeah, I have to prepare and etc. But in the end, it's God that makes me remember certain things and put them out. And that doesn't happen just to me. It happens to anybody, to someone who's painting, to someone who's talking, to someone who's singing, to someone who's playing music, whatever. It's God speaking when we are trying to present God. And God's most real speaking is that in the face of which human speech is silence. In the end, there's nothing I can say, there's nothing an artist can paint, there's nothing anyone can play in music, there's no writing, there's no preaching, there's nothing that has any value except in being there and waiting for God, so to speak. So God speaking demands personal surrender as the condition for hearing it. And, you know, I do not believe in God the puppeteer, but I do believe in the presence of God. And I know that the presence of God is here at this moment, as it is at many other moments in which each one of us are interacting, to use Stein's word, empathically with others. Okay, so we have about a half hour left, and I am going to stop my share. In case you wanted, there's my email address, but you'll all get a copy of this. And what I'm going to do now is turn that off and come back here and just whatever. Let me just turn the share screen off. Let me just turn this off. Okay, no, it doesn't go away. You're seeing me, right?
We see you and not your screen. So you did turn it off.
Oh, okay. So it's in the background, but who cares? Okay. So anyone who has a question can either ask the chat and Corey will read it to me, or can, unmute yourself and ask me the question, whatever you want, about either the first part about her life, about this last part where she's talking about ways of knowing God, or, whatever curiosity asks you to ask.
So, Oliva, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
And that is, it seems like there's a lot of Martin Buber's I and Thou in Edith's work. And I've never read anything that said that, but it seems like there's like a lot of her work sits on his ideas of empathy, um, going beyond oneself, seeing the other, and that includes nature. It includes nature.
Yeah. I never heard anything about Buber influencing her, and they were contemporary, so it's possible that she read him, or maybe she just didn't. I mean, it's, and she doesn't mention him, and no one mentions a connection between the two of them.
No.
So there may be, great minds think alike. So it may be that they just had some similarities, but I don't know that there's a direct influence of one on the other in this sense. There was a question in the chat, I believe. Yes?
Yes. Catherine asked, what books would you recommend reading about Edith's life and writings?
Okay, there are a number of biographies of her. The book on women and the life in a Jewish family are relatively, easy to read both. But there are other biographies. Her niece has written a number of things about her, and I'm trying to think of a biography of her in English that there's one by Posselt, Posselt, but it's sort of old. Let me look and think about that, because there are lots of things that are coming out about her, but they're mostly about her philosophy and actually very dense to read. So let me think about a biography that, because the ones that I'm coming to mind are not in English. So let me just look for that, and I'll add it to the site or something. I'll figure out with Corey how to put that out. Okay. Another question.
Okay.
Yes.
Is it me? I don't know. Do you hear me?
Yeah, it's you. You're there, Clara. Okay.
I'm trying to figure out what how to deal with this. Well, anyway, here's my quandary. I finally hear some of her, how she connected with that mystical experience that led her to become a
Carmelite.
A Carmelite and a religious person from being an atheist. But in her descriptions of her experience of encountering God in silence and in quietude and in stillness, I don't hear anything about love, about feeling loved by God or feeling loving God, and then also she has this relationship with St. John of the Cross, which has these poems where he's totally in love with Jesus and expresses it in such a wonderful manner. And so I'm just wondering, do we know anything about her personal relationships with that would bring up the feeling of love towards others in a way that is not?
Yeah. Okay. So one of the books that from the Institute of Carmelite Studies, they have published a volume of her letters that are also fairly easy reading. And in that, we hear details of her life, and we hear her, her connections with her friends and how she loves her friends and how she loves her family. She talks very much about loving her mother in the biography, in the life in a Jewish family. So the letters are sort of a testimony of her connection. But again, because she's a very, I'm going to sound stereotypical. She's very German. It's like, you know, there's sort of a wall in front of her when it comes to the expression of feelings. So we have to read in between the lines. Like in this treaty, when she's saying Dionysius said this theology, this, that, and the other. And then at the end, she starts talking a little bit more without saying every 2 words Dionysius said. So you start, which is what I just gave you. So you start getting a sense that there's more of her in that. And when she's talking in the book about John of the Cross, when she's talking about John of the Cross, you can feel how close she feels to him, how connected she feels. But it's all mixed with this disquisitions. I mean, she's talking about John of the Cross, and she's not talking about the love of the cross. She's talking about the science.
Right.
So there's something about her style that makes it sound distant. When in fact, actually, the people who knew her niece, for example, she prepared skits for the family and they laughed about playing. She imitated people a lot. She was very good at imitating people. And she was a great dancer in her youth. And, you know, so there are all those things that we know about her that seem to be different than this rigid, distant person that we read when she writes. Probably the letters are the place where she is. And there are some parts of the Science of the Cross book that are very tender when she's describing how John felt, but it's not how she felt.
She keeps that to herself. Yes.
Yes, right, exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else? Bev?
Yes, Oliva.
Yes.
This has been wonderful. You have been wonderful. What led you to follow Edith Stein so deeply and completely?
Well, you know, I have my favorite saints. Those are the ones I have written about in my book, in the Women's Sainthood and Power. I think you all have seen this one, the Women's Sainthood and Power. Okay. It was sort of a matter of chance. Many years ago, when I was living in Costa Rica, I read a booklet about her life and I did not remember her name, but it was the story, it was her story. And I found it intriguing, but forgot about her. And then sometime in the 90s, when I was doing a sabbatical at Stanford, I was in the Stanford library and I don't know why, I found a book about her, about the controversy of her beatification and canonization, and sort of read it. But what made it more directly is the Jewish Studies, the Institute of Jewish Studies or Center, I don't remember what, of Jewish Studies at San Diego State. When the beatification and the canonization were coming up, people in there were, again, sort of having all these contradictions about what does this mean. Most of them, of course, were Jews. And the director of that institute, Lawrence Barron, who was my, my friend, my colleague, said, could you please explain to us what this canonization business means? And what about her makes her be, whatever. So I said, okay. And so I started reading seriously. So my first paper about Edith Stein was written for Jews.
I love it.
at San Diego State, explaining to them what I understood about her and her life and the reasons for this. And I used a lot of these women rabbis who write about her, and there are a number of people, Jews and Catholics, who have written about her, both good and bad and contradictory and etc. So I did a lot of that when I put together that presentation. And one of these Jewish women writers ends some of her writings saying, if her existence makes Catholics become more aware of the Holocaust and try to understand Jews better and try to educate themselves about Jews better, her life and death can be a blessing.
Amazing.
And I thought that was very moving and ended my talk with that. And in fact, someone in the audience was very annoyed with me and said, how could you say it's a blessing that someone was killed in the Holocaust? So that's not what I'm saying, but okay. So it's very controversial. To talk about her always comes and goes and makes all sorts of reactions from people. And when we were in Rome for the canonization with a group of students, some of my students were eating in a restaurant just by coincidence next to some of Stein's relatives. Like 100 of her relatives from all over the world came to the canonization ceremony. And some of them were there. And so they started talking about why they were there. And the relatives said, we don't agree with the canonization. And my students said, then why are you here? And they said, because it's a time of connecting with a family that we haven't seen for 50 years. So there was something there's something she does of connection, even when people are disagreeing and are even annoyed with each other. So that's, and I also feel the affinity that she was an academic.
Yes.
So her life was devoted to academic work and teaching, in addition to whatever she did by way of praying that she didn't want to talk about. So, I feel close to her that way.
You've allowed us to feel close to her. At least I speak for myself. Thank you.
Okay, well, glad that that's the case.
Hi, Oliva. This is Anita.
Uh-huh.
Well, of course, I'm fascinated and drawn to her.
Yeah.
In so many ways. So I'm wondering a little bit about how you think she would have felt about her canonization. And I'm having this sense that she would not have wanted to have talked about her own faith journey.
Yes. Right.
Not only because it was so profound. Do you think it was because of what she had to say about when we have this connection with God, we are in this place beyond words?
Yes. Yeah.
Did she not want to be idle? She wanted to put an end to the idolization of women. She did not want to be idolized and made larger than life. Maybe could you speak a little bit to that?
Okay, well, she was very intent on getting women respected and understanding that she believed women had an educational mission for all the church that she thought was very important and that men were not good at. So she's doing that. And at the same time, she's saying, but that doesn't mean that, we are going to put women in a pedestal, because that's another way of depriving women of the right to be. When you're in a pedestal, you're in a stable position and you can fall. So no pedestals. The reality that women can do things and etc. So that. Would she have agreed with what did she think about her own canonization? I don't know. She probably would have said, huh? What? But on the other hand, she would have said, if this contributes to the connection between Christians and Jews, then by all means, canonize me. So, because that, it was very, and it's interesting, you know, some Jews completely reject the idea that she has anything to do with Judaism because she rejected it. There are others like Rachel Brenner who say she didn't reject it. She did not convert out of convenience. She converted out of conviction. And actually, Rachel Brenner said to me, she was here speaking about Edith Stein, and she said to me, I understand, I as a Jew, understand conversion of convenience. I do not understand conversion of conviction, because that makes me think about things in a completely different way. And she didn't go into what made her think and what she thought and whatever may have been there. But from the paragraph I quoted from her, it's very clear that Brenner saw, and there are other Jews who write about her, like these women ministers, who say, I may disagree with the fact that she converted, but I understand why she converted. You know, I have a sense of what pushed her in this direction. And at the same time, I understand that she continued to feel like a Jew. Like, you know, when the persecution started, and this is from a little pamphlet also she wrote, or several pages she wrote, called The Road to Carmel, in which she talks about the things that pushed her to be a Carmelite. And one of the things is what you read. The destiny of these people is my own. Now I'm sharing the fate of the Jewish people. And I'm going to die because I'm sharing the fate of the Jewish people. She didn't say I'm dying because I'm a Catholic martyr. That's something that was constructed after. But she was very, and her last testament was, I'm dying for, you know, I'm offering my life for the Jewish people, for my family, and so the Antichrist can be defeated. There's something in the chat that I cannot read completely. 1 second, let me see what it says. Perhaps it is distance of writing program because omitting it allowed her to keep her Jewish roots that's still relevant and tied to her overall. Maybe. I mean, it's so hard to know what she would do that, because, you know, when she's writing about Thomas Aquinas and the relationship of Thomas Aquinas and Husserl, and when she's writing about her last big volume was Finite and Eternal Being, she's writing very much as a Catholic philosopher, not as a Jewish philosopher. In reality, I mean, she did not know enough about Judaism. And like all converts, she thought that, you know, the new religion was much better than the old one. So, but she never said, I'm not Jewish. And in fact, when her canonization process was initiated, some of the nuns in her convent, Germans of the time of Hitler, of course, said she should not be canonized because she defended Jews too much. So she was, I mean, I can only imagine as a person of what the intense pain must have been for a person who identifies with the Jewish people, with her Jewish family, who feels that she's going to end up, that she's sharing the fate of the Jewish people. And at the same time, it's Catholic and wants to be a good Catholic, and it's a Catholic philosopher, and it's a nun, and it's, you know, a Catholic that way. That to be in that place at that moment in history that was so absolutely horrendous and be torn in both directions. I can only imagine the pain she was going through And again, it's interesting that she doesn't say a word. You know, she talks about, this is a difficult moment, we have to deal with it, but never like, I'm tormented by this, or maybe she wasn't tormented. Maybe she managed to be at peace with all that horrible contradiction. But, you know, I feel close to her in a strange way, because of course she's the one who's closest to us in time. So, I mean, I was alive when she was alive. For several years. I mean, I was a little child, but I was alive when she was alive. So our lives overlapped. And, you know, and there's so many things that I understand about the academic world and discrimination in the academic world. And you're trying to put out your writing and some people don't understand it. And, you know, there's so many things about her life that look so much like my own, that I feel very close to her. And yet I wish she would have said more about, I feel this about these things, not just I think this about these things. But, you know, that's what we have.
Oliva, this has been a wonderful talk, and I am so grateful to you. I'm wondering to what extent the cross, her feelings about the cross, which much have been immensely contradictory, may have played in it being her secret. I wonder if you've thought about what that might mean.
She made the cross very much the center of her religious life. It was the name she chose.
Yeah.
And this whole book on John of the Cross is about the meaning of the cross in Christianity. And in there, she's not talking much about the cross and the Jews. She's talking about the meaning of the cross for Christianity. But I have to say that she had a depth of connection, a depth of understanding of the meaning of the cross that I don't know if I fully understand. I mean, that's the truth. I mean, she was so deeply understanding the meaning of the cross that it was very central to her religious life, most definitely. That's why she chose that name, and that's why she chose to write about the science of the cross, in which he talks about, you know, we've talked about John of the Cross before, so she talks about a lot of those things and etc. So it's probably that was the first book, as I said, that was translated into Spanish. I probably need to go read the whole book again. Because, you know, I'm sure, like happens with everything, the more you read about something, the more you understand what you're reading next time. So it probably will be good for me to read it again.
Thank you.
So, anyway, we are about to finish. And yes, it's very important to remember that Jesus was a Jew. And actually, this is an interesting thing. Stein was the first Jew to be canonized after the initial church, in which Peter and Paul and Matthew and Luke and John and the Virgin Mary and the rest of them, who are all Jews, who are central figures in Christianity and sort of were assumed to be saint without really thinking of any kind of canonization ceremony. So from that time of the primitive church, the only Jew, or the first, I don't know if another one has been, but probably the only one, the only Jew canonized has been Stein. And also, she's the only person who was canonized both as a martyr, like the martyrs in the primitive church, and a confessor, which is people who write and teach about Christianity. And there's a movement to declare her Doctor of the Church, although I don't know if that's going to happen. But she was declared patron of Europe or co-patron of Europe by John Paul II, together with Catherine of Siena and Bridget. Catherine and Bridget are the two patronesses of Europe, and Edith Stein was added by John Paul as one of the patron saints of Europe. It's interesting that it's 3 women, but that's another story. We are not going to get into that. So yeah, so that's that. Okay, so we have about 2 more minutes to go. And I want to thank all of you for being here. Feel free to look at the, to look at the video when it's available. And if you have questions and whatever, do write to me and ask, and I'll do my best. And I'll try to think of a biography and give it to Corey to send to everyone. Thank you all for all your questions and for your attention during these 2 long hours. It's always a pleasure for me to be with all of you. Take care. Love you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Oliva, for sharing your wisdom and your insight. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today. We should get the recording out within the week. So if you registered for this, you'll be able to access that, and you can share that recording with anyone. So if someone wasn't able to attend and you're like, oh, you might enjoy this, feel free to share that link. But yeah, that concludes our time together. Linda, did you want to play us out with some harp music?
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you all, and we look forward to our next time together.